Is there any discussion on the bill? Mr. Lawler, you are now recognized.
Thank you, Madam Chair. In the wake of the reprehensible terrorist attacks against our closest ally, Israel, on October 7th, it's paramount that we work to break down the dark web of connections that enable such violence. We've stood by Israel in its darkest hours, and today we reiterate that support, ensuring the safety and security of the Israeli people from these threats. A primary source of the threats against Israel comes from the funding that these terror groups receive from Iran, which is why it is so critical that we kneecap Iran's ability to provide this support. The Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act, otherwise known as the SHIP Act, which I introduced earlier this year with my House Foreign Affairs Committee colleague, Jared Moskowitz of Florida, does just that by going after one of its primary funding sources, the Iranian oil trade. The U.S. has rightly sanctioned Iranian oil, a common-sense measure in the fight to prevent Iran from acquiring additional capital with which to fund terrorism. However, it's disheartening to see other nations do not share this commitment. In August of this year alone, China imported a staggering 1.5 million barrels per day of Iranian oil. China is sending a clear message to the rest of the world by supporting the Iranian regime. In doing so, China and other importers of Iranian oil have become complicit in the nefarious acts carried out with that funding. The SHIP Act, which we are marking up here today, currently has over 200 bipartisan co-sponsors. The support is a testament to Congress's united resolve against Iran and against its enablers. The SHIP Act specifically mandates that the President impose sanctions on entities that knowingly process illicit Iranian oil, from individuals operating ports that accept vessels transporting Iranian oil to those refining this oil. Every enabler in this supply chain must face consequences. The bill also clearly states that these sanctions are not a permanent feature. They can be terminated if Iran stops supporting international terrorism and halts the development of biological and chemical weapons and missiles. Yet beyond the provisions of the SHIP Act, there's a larger message here, a message about the kind of world we want to live in, a world where nations collaborate to thwart terrorism, one where allies stand up against any entity that compromises global peace and prosperity. Israel's pain is a somber reminder of the consequences of complacency. We must ensure that Iran has no money with which to fund extremist groups that destabilize the Middle East and the world. We need to send a clear message that countries, that they must reconsider their priorities and not allow the weight of their transactions to indirectly shed innocent blood. We as the United States possess the power and the moral obligation to shape the global order. The SHIP Act is more than just a piece of legislation. It's our commitment to a safer, more peaceful world. It's our pledge to Israel and every nation that the United States values above all else peace, security, and freedom. Let us work together to get this bill passed to ensure peace, safety, and security in the Middle East, especially for our ally Israel. I look forward to engaging in discussion today about the merits of the bill and why it is so critical that the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the United States Congress is united in opposition to Iran and its enablers. I have here amendments in the nature of a substitute to make a few changes to this bipartisan bill, largely technical corrections, and other additions to ensure there are no unintended consequences of the bill. The goal here is to impose sanctions on Iran and its enablers and cut off their funding that they have used to massacre the Jewish people. That's exactly what this bill and this ANS is targeted to do. At a time like this, we cannot be passive. We must take action. I yield back.
The chair now recognizes Mr. Castro for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairwoman. I speak in opposition to H.R. 3774, which I believe would undermine our national security, harm our allies, and hurt our economy. This bill is based on a flawed premise that we know all too well by now. that more sanctions on Iran will coerce their leaders to engage in good faith negotiations with the United States. The reality is that this bill would do the opposite of what it intends to do. It would isolate the United States, alienate our partners, and empower Iran's hardliners. This bill would sanction any ships, shipping company, or port that handles Iranian oil. This would have devastating effects on the global economy and on oil prices. If this bill were enacted, U.S. companies would be prohibited from doing any business, including transferring goods, at many of the world's biggest ports, including in some of our largest allies and economic partners. This bill would disrupt global trade, supply chains, and damage our relations with important allies and partners. Not only would this bill cause a wholesale disruption of the global economy, but it would also raise gas prices and consumer prices here at home. This bill would also have a devastating effect on our constituents domestically by raising those gas and consumer prices. If this broad, sweeping bill were enacted, Americans would feel the pain at the gas pump and the grocery store. This is irresponsible legislation, I believe. Mr. Chairman or Madam Chairwoman, I've been a consistent supporter for diplomacy, dialogue, and even sensible sanctions when it comes to Iran. I've also been a vocal critic of Iran's human rights abuses, its support for terrorism, and its destabilizing activities in the region. I believe that we need to hold Iran accountable for its actions, but we also need to pursue a realistic and pragmatic approach that advances our interests and values. For that reason, I oppose the bill as drafted and urge my colleagues to also oppose this measure. I yield back.
Thank you, Mr. Castro. I now like to recognize myself to say a few words about this bill. And I speak in strong support of Representative Lawler's Stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act, which I am a co-sponsor. This bipartisan legislation will close a loophole in our sanctions policy that allows Iran to move oil through refineries and ports that are not directly sanctioned. Iran exploits this loophole and uses the revenue it earns from oil sales to continue financing terrorism abroad, including Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad. Iran has provided Hamas and Palestinian Islamic Jihad with tens of millions of dollars, and these groups, in turn, used this funding to build the rockets that are falling on Israel as we speak. Iran also provides Hezbollah with the most of its funding, training weapons, and explosives. In the aftermath of Hamas terrorist attacks on Israel, and as Hezbollah continues escalating on Israel's northern border, it is critical that we take all actions necessary to ensure that the Iranian regime cannot continue exploiting loopholes in our sanctions policy to fund Hamas, Palestinian Islamic Jihad, and Hezbollah's horrific activities in the Middle East. So I urge my colleagues to support this bill, and I yield the balance of my time. Now I would like to recognize Ranking Member Meeks.
I share the same goal as the sponsors of this legislation, and that is to prevent Iran from profiting off its petroleum reserves. The tyrannical Iranian regime uses these profits to fund its terrorism and proxy activities, as well as to make advancements in its nuclear program. In fact, it was strict, targeted, multilateral sanctions applied on Iranian petroleum and banking that drove Iran to the table to negotiate the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action, resulting in a verifiable agreement that cut off every pathway to an Iranian nuclear weapon. The bill before us today aims to apply unilateral mandatory sanctions on anyone who does any of the following with Iranian oil: operate a port that accepts or transfers the oil, operate a refinery that processes Iranian oil, runs a business that purchases, sells, or finances Iranian oil, ships Iranian oil, or knowingly works at any facility that handles Iranian oil. Without a doubt, the target of these sanctions is China, the largest purchaser of Iranian oil. If China stopped buying oil from Iran, Iran would be starved of the funds it uses to destabilize its region and the world. But this is not something we can achieve overnight without causing ripples in the global economy. In today's interconnected world, where China is a major player and trading partner of the United States, we cannot be expected to be shielded from economic impacts at home. We must acknowledge that the scope of these proposed sanctions is massive. Without a doubt, if fully implemented, there would be sufficient chaos in the global energy markets, commercial shipping, and port operations when we go after China's oil purchases in this matter. Gas prices in our own country would certainly rise, and the middle-class families would be immediately impacted. Shipping from Asia to the United States could be stalled, denying American goods they require. Again, the scope of this bill is massive. Throughout my career in Congress, I have viewed sanctions as a diplomatic tool and not necessarily as an end on their own. The Foreign Affairs Committee is the committee of diplomacy, and sanctions are one of the most important and impactful tools that we have in managing our relationships and security around the globe. Sanctions have to be limber. The executive branch that administers them needs to be able to adjust and scale them up and down as needed to make them successful. Unfortunately, the waiver within this bill provides the executive with very limited flexibility. It is one of the strictest standards that can be found in law. In other words, the waiver provision is nearly unusable, and I think this standard must be adjusted to make this bill workable. Another problem is that it is an extreme tool we don't even know will work. During the height of the Trump administration's maximum pressure campaign, sanctions were levied against a major Chinese shipping company, Costco, that at times had moved shipments of Iranian oil. The Trump administration had to pull these sanctions off the books after only a few months because they quickly learned the impact of global energy and logistics markets was far too damaging. And that was just one company. The scope of this legislation is much, much larger. Finally, the difference between this proposal and the petroleum sanctions of the pre-JCPOA era is that this effort is unilateral, whereas previous sanctions were done in a multilateral manner. We did the hard work of uniting the world behind the policy before implementation of the sanctions. Here, we'll be going at it alone. And we must keep in mind that taking this oil immediately off the market in this manner will be a direct benefit to Russia, who will profit from higher oil prices and increased demand. The infusion of cash for Putin would be a body blow to our Ukrainian friends. And I want to be able to support this bill, but it is not ready for prime time. But I must thank Chairman McCaul and his staff, who's worked hard, his staff, for making some meaningful changes to the original bill leading up to this markup. The unprecedented sanctions have been removed that quite literally would have sanctioned the entire world. There's a new safe harbor for companies that take significant and variable steps towards permanently terminating Iranian oil dealings, and there are better protections for family members that have nothing to do with their family members' crimes.
Gentleman's time has expired, and I recognize myself now for 5 minutes in support of Representative Lawler's legislation to stop Harboring Iranian Petroleum Act of 2023. This is a crucial piece of legislation that seeks to impose targeted sanctions on foreign persons and entities engaging in activities that undermine international efforts to curb Iran's illicit trade in petroleum and petrochemicals. I want to address the ranking member's concerns and the gentleman from Texas's concerns in a minute, but let me just first tell you why I support Mr. Lawler's bill. As a member of both the House Foreign Affairs Committee and the National Security Subcommittee, the House Financial Services Committee, with oversight over the Treasury Department's implementation and enforcement of sanctions, I firmly believe that this bill is a vital step in stopping a key source of illegal funding to Iran and cutting off the mullah's cash cow to fund their ongoing terrorist activities in support of Hamas's brazen and illegal war against Israeli citizens. The measures outlined in this legislation specifically target foreign persons or entities that knowingly facilitate the transport of Iranian crude oil, engage in transactions involving petroleum products from Iran, operate vessels from ship-to-ship transfers of these products, or own and operate refineries processing Iranian petroleum products. In addition, the bill addresses those who are associated with these entities and those who attempt to hide their assets. The significance of these sanctions: 1, it curbs Iranian oil trade; 2, it disrupts the petrochemical trade; 3, it prevents ship-to-ship transfers; 4, it hinders refining activities; and 5, it holds associated individuals accountable. And finally, blocked or owned control entities. By imposing sanctions on entities owned or controlled by these entities engaged in these activities, we cut off the avenues for evasion and deter foreign actors from participating in such conduct. In light of Iran's support for the unprovoked attack against Israel by Hamas, it is essential for us to stand together united in our commitment to cut off all financing to Iran's war machine. And I would note significant bipartisan support for Mr. Lawler's bill, notwithstanding the opposition voiced by the gentleman from Texas and the ranking member's reservations. The bill before us is not just a message to Iran, but to the entire world that we are unwavering in our resolve to combat illicit activities that threaten global stability. I urge my colleagues to join me in supporting this legislation. Now let me turn to some of the objections offered by my colleague from Texas and then the ranking member. Why? Why are my colleagues so determined to be soft on Iran after what we have witnessed over the last several days? Why? Why are we chasing sanctions relief? Why are we afraid to punish the very perpetrators of this act against humanity? Why are we so appeasing to terrorists? This is a moment to stand side by side with our allies in Israel, not to go soft on the very sponsors and enablers of these heinous crimes against humanity. Why would we accommodate and help the financing of this outrageous war? My friends talk about the impact on global energy markets. They talk about pain at the gas pump. Well, then why on earth are my colleagues who are worried about pain at the gas pump declaring war on American energy production? Why do they vote against H.R. 1? If you're worried about rewarding Putin, my goodness, vote for more energy production here at home. Oppose this crazy idea of politicizing financial flows to American companies through ESG. Stop blocking the Keystone XL pipeline. Stop blocking licenses for oil and gas producers in the United States. If you want to lower the price at the pump and be able to have the geopolitical tools to punish Iran without hurting our allies or the United States, then you can chew gum and walk at the same time. You can impose tough sanctions on the financing of this war and cripple the Iranian oil industry and those who help it, while at the same time increasing production to the rest of the world. This is why the Democrats' war on American energy has geopolitical ramifications. It ties our hands and disables our ability to use the tools of foreign policy available to us, our sanctions. So, what I would say, if you're concerned about global energy prices, if you're concerned about Americans feeling pain at the pump, then support Mr. Lawler's bill and support American energy production at the same time. What planet are we living on when you express concern about pain at the pump and wanting to go easy on Iran's oil industry, which, by the way, has emissions much higher than American oil production, but you want to punish and discriminate against American energy production? It makes absolutely zero sense. I guess climate change only applies to American energy, but it doesn't apply to Iranian energy. Let's get real, people. Get tough on Iran, block the financing, and if you're worried about the impact on global energy markets, my gosh, vote for Republicans' bill to increase energy production in the United States, both to lower the price at the pump for Americans, but also to give us the geopolitical tools that we can use and not reward Putin and not reward the mullahs in Tehran. With that, I yield.